Today's daf is Eruvin, Daf Kuf Gimel. We are almost at the end. Today's daf is dedicated by Sue Ann Hochberg in honor of her children, Zev, Daniel, and Hannah Page, the miracles of her life. She loves you now and forever. If you haven't registered for the SIEM, you can still register. At this point, we've already sent out the links and everything to the SIEM. So if you register now, you'll see on the registration, you can find the links and whatever it is that you need to know to the Zoom, etc. Okay, we're going to start from, I'll just review quickly from the Mishnah at the bottom of Kuf Bet Amud Bet. We were learning yesterday about Koshrim Nima B'Mikdash. If you have a harp and the string tears, so you can tie it in the Mikdash, but not in the Medina. And this is because, again, Shvut, we allow any derabanan in the Mikdash. So we're going to allow you to do this. We're going to have to see exactly according to who this is, though, because this isn't tying a malacha deoraita, forbidden by Torah law. So why is it allowed? Then we said, in betchila kam bekanasul. But if you do it from the beginning, meaning you decided to tie a string onto a harp when it didn't have a string to begin with, then we don't allow it at all, not even in the Mikdash. So the Gemara, first of all, brings a contradiction and says, in a Braita, it says, Nima kinor shenifseka lo haya koshra ela onva. You can't tie it because, again, that's forbidden by Torah law, but you can tie it like a bow. So we're going to try to resolve this and have a number of answers. The first two answers we saw yesterday, lo kashya ha Rabbanan, ha Rabbi Eliezer. Remember, the difference, the machlokah between them was about machshirei mitzvah. Rabbi Eliezer damar machshirei mitzvah dochin et hashabat, meaning even forget about that in Mikdash, you can do derabanans, rabbinic prohibitions. No, here we're talking about anything that you need to prepare for a mitzvah, that's going to be allowed on Shabbat. So Eliezer says that's allowed. That's the Mishnah. You can tie it. V'chachamim, the Rabbanan damrei ein dochin onva. Since they don't think that the preparations for a mitzvah can override Shabbat, so they say you can tie it like a bow. But now the Gemara says, no, that doesn't make sense, because if we hold Rabbi Eliezer, then even if you're going to say machshirei mitzvah dochin et Shabbat, even to prepare the harp from the beginning should be allowed. And that in our Mishnah said it's not allowed. So therefore they try a second option. Ela lo kashya ha Rabbi Yehuda ha Rabbanan. Must be one is Rabbi Yehuda, one is Rabbanan. What's the machlokah Rabbi Yehuda Rabbanan? Saw this in the past, which is Rabbi Yehuda says tying a bow is just as forbidden as tying a knot. Therefore, if we're going to allow something in the Mikdash, we're going to allow it even with tying a bow, even with tying a knot, because there's no difference tying a knot or tying a bow. According to Rabbanan, tying a bow is better because tying a bow is allowed and tying a knot is forbidden by Torah law. So therefore, better. That's even though machshirei mitzvah. Well, again, we're going to have to see according to who we're holding by, but assuming we're holding like Rabbi Eliezer, that even machshirei mitzvah push off Shabbat, still we'd rather do it in a way that's less problematic. So let's do aniva. But now they say Rabbi Yehuda liba deman. So according to who do we go? And that's this Rabbi Yehuda opinion that you can't tie an aniva either. And therefore he says, well, you can even tie a knot because you have no other choice. Again, we're back to square one. If the whole idea, and as I explained it, is according to Rabbi Eliezer, that machshirei mitzvah or dochin, it's just we'd rather you do less than do more. Do it in a way that's not forbidden by Torah law if you have an alternative. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, there is no alternative, so therefore we'll allow it even tying a knot. Then again, we're back to the first question, which is afilu lechatchila nami. Then we should allow it even from the start, meaning even if your harp had no strings, we should be allowed to tie it. And our Mishnah didn't say you could. So therefore, they're rejecting that answer. So here comes our next answer. Ela lo kashya ha Rabbi Shimon ha Rabbanan. Okay, so now we're going to say, no, there's actually a different debate. Okay, the debate is between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbanan, and what are these opinions? Titania. Ben Levi shenifsakalo nima b'kinor. If you have a Ben Levi, one of the Levites who has one of the strings breaks on his harp, koshra, according to Rabbanan, the rabbis, you can tie it. That's going to match our Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon omer onva. That's going to match the Braita. Rabbi Shimon says tie it in a bow. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar omer. Here's a third approach, which doesn't appear not in our Mishnah, not in the Braita. Api enam mashmat et hakol. No, it's not going to work if you tie it or tie it with a bow. None of those are actually going to make the sound come out nicely. So therefore, none of those are alternatives. So therefore, what does he say? The harp was made with two pegs coming out, one at the top, one at the bottom, and they would wrap the string around the peg. So what do? If it cuts in the middle, if the string tears in the middle, you unwind on one of the sides, start it from the other side, and then wind it back up again. Okay, so either from the top or from the bottom, untie it and then wrap it around. Again, it's not really tying. I shouldn't say untie. Unwind it and then wind it back around. In this case, there's actually no tying taking place. So he says that's how you do it. So, and therefore, we're back to, okay, his opinion is not so important for our purposes, but he's basically saying doing it this way, that's the way it's going to be effective. None of those other ways is actually going to make the proper musical sense. So he says this is the way you have to do it. In any case, like we said, the Mishnah is the Chachamim, which says you can tie it, and Rabbi Shimon matches the Braita. Okay, so that was another option. But now the Gemara gives a few other options. Ibai Dema, it doesn't reject this option, it just suggests that maybe there's a different option. Ibai Dema Hava HaRabanan. Okay, so they're both the rabbi's opinion, okay, who said that that machshirei mitzvah are not they said machshirei mitzvah are dochin et hashabbat, and you can actually tie it. But now, why did one say tie and one said tie it in a bow? Because lo kasha kam be'emtza kam min hatzad. If it tears in the middle, okay, then if you tie it with a bow, it's not going to make a good sound. But if it tears on the side, then you can tie it in a bow and it'll make a good sound, right? Because again, it'll be taut and then it'll be fine. So therefore, one is, again, the Mishnah is in the middle. When it tears in the middle, then you're allowed to tie it because tying with a bow won't really fix your problem. And if it's min hatzad, then better to tie it with a bow, because again, that's always the better alternative. Ve'ibait ema, last option, hava ha'be'emtza, mar savar gazlinan umar savar lo gazlinan. We're going to say they're both in the middle. And theoretically, if that's the case, it's not going to work if you tie it with a bow, and therefore you're allowed to tie it with a knot. However, we're going to say that better, according to our Mishnah, you can do it. You can tie a knot even in the middle. And according to the Braita, you can't tie a knot because we don't allow you to tie it because you might come to Gazrinan, you might end up making a knot. Right. We're going to assume that if we allow it on the side, in the middle, you're going to think that it's allowed also on the side. And really on the side, like we said previously, you're only allowed to tie it in a bow, and therefore they don't allow you to tie it in a knot. Okay, on to the next Mishnah. Chotchim yabelet b'mikdash aval lo b'medina. If you have, now there's a debate actually whether we're talking about a yabelet is a wart, and it's a mum, both for the Kohen, a priest that has a mum, that has a yabelet, a wart, it will be a problem, and you have to remove it. Or maybe we're talking about an animal that you want to bring for a sacrifice. Also, it's a mum. So there's a debate whether we're talking about an animal or a human. Either which way, the Mishnah says you can do it in the mikdash. You're allowed to cut it off. Now, what's the issue of cutting it off? So they say it's a tolada of gozes. It's a tolada of the malacha of shearing. Therefore, you're not allowed to do this, but we allow it in the mikdash because we're going to assume it's only a durabanan, and therefore it's only forbidden by rabbinic law. And then we're going to have to figure out why is it only forbidden by rabbinic law, and that's because the Mishnah says, "Ve'im bikli kan v'kan asul." In other words, the obvious is we must be talking about in the first part that you do it by hand. Doing something by hand is not forbidden by Torah law because you would never shear a sheep without using a utensil. So therefore, it would have to be cutting it off with a utensil. If you did it by hand, it wouldn't be a problem. Again, it would be forbidden only by rabbinic law, and therefore we allow it in the temple. Again, it's to allow us to be able to do a mitzvah, either to allow the Kohen to perform or to allow the animal to be brought as a sacrifice. So now the Gemara says again, Ureminu, but this contradicts the following source. Here, Kivo, this is a source that's talking about, it's a Mishnah in Psachim. We'll get to it soon, although it's Samachay, so we have 2 months. But it says in the following Mishnah, if you were bringing the animal for the Korban Pesach is Dochesh Shabbat. So let's say it happens on Shabbat, and here Kivo, you carry it. Vehava'ato michutz latchum. In other words, both you carry it in the public domain and you bring it outside the tchum, from outside the tchum Shabbat. Bechatichat yabalto, and cutting off a wart. Ein dochin. This is not going to push off Shabbat, meaning you're not allowed to do any of these things on Shabbat. Rabbi Eliezer omer dochin. According to Rabbi Eliezer, it is. But what do you see here? According to Tanakama, it's not going to push off Shabbat. You're not allowed to do this on Shabbat. So what did they answer? They're going to bring 2 different answers. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina. Chad amar, ha v'ha belecha. Both are moist yabalot, moist warts, which means they're live. Okay, once it's dead, it's not going to be a problem to take it off. But here we're going to see both, in the first opinion, they're both talking about moist. Below kashya kam biyad kam bekli. The Mishnah, our Mishnah is talking about if you do it by hand, and the Mishnah in Pesachim is talking about if you do it with a utensil. Utensil is forbidden. Now remember, our Mishnah said hand is okay, utensil is forbidden. So then we're going to say the Mishnah in Pesachim is talking about just with utensil. So we'll get back to this. Some say no. The other opinion of the other Emorah says that they're both biyad. Okay, you did it both in the Mishnah and in the Mishnah in Pesachim. It's by hand. So then why would we forbid? We just said it was okay. So why is it not okay according to Pesachim? Ours is dry. That's why it's allowed. But the other one is moist, and that's we don't permit it. So now we're going to have, why doesn't each one say like the other? And we're going to have a bunch of back and forths. The first, if you're going to say the distinction is yad or kli, why didn't you say moist or dry? So that's because once it's dried out, they hold it should be a problem. It shouldn't be a problem even with a utensil. And what did our Mishnah say? It's only good if you do it by hand, but not if you do it with a utensil. My taima ifruche ifracha. Why? Because it's just crumbling up something that's already dead. Okay, so because of that, it shouldn't be a problem, even bikli. So that's why they didn't think that that's what our Mishnah was referring to, because our Mishnah distinguishes between utensil and by hand. Why didn't he say yad and kli? That seems like a pretty good answer. Amar lacha, bikli hatnan, im bikli kam bekanasul. Why would the Mishnah in Pesachim be referring to a kli that you did it with a utensil when our Mishnah already told us if it's with a utensil, it's going to be forbidden both in the mikdash and outside the mikdash, which means that we already know that. And Mishnayot don't usually repeat something we already learned in another Mishnah. So that's why they didn't think that that was a good explanation. V'idach, so now how's the person who thinks that that's a good explanation going to respond to that? Is what's the point of having the Mishnah when we already know that from another Mishnah? The new point that the Mishnah in Pesachim was making is that Rabbi Eliezer disagrees, and he allows it even with the utensil, because remember, Rabbi Eliezer holds anything that you need to get a mitzvah done can be done on Shabbat without a problem. So therefore, they wanted to add that, and that's why the Mishnah repeats it, even though the utensil part was already mentioned in our Mishnah. V'idach. Now we're going to go back to the other opinion. Why did they not say habiyad habakli? Why did they say yivesha and lecha? V'idach dumiyad dehir kivo vavato michutz l'tchum katane derabanan. Dehir kivo vavato michutz l'tchum. Okay, if you carry the animal and you bring it from outside the tchum, those are all derabanan issues. Okay, and therefore we're going to say, since those are derabanan issues, then they must be talking about biyad, because that opinion says they're both talking about biyad. It's just one is dry and one is moist. Once you say it's biyad, you drop it down to rabbinic, because remember we said gozez is down with a utensil. Shearing the sheep is always done with a utensil, and therefore it's only going to be forbidden by Torah law if you're doing it with a utensil. And therefore the machloket between the two different opinions are referring to two different situations, but they're all talking about taking it off biyad, with your hand. Meaning we want it to be a derabanan, because then it's similar to the other cases mentioned in that Mishnah, which were derabanan, issues of carrying it and bringing it from out of the tchum. Okay, now you might say carrying should be deoraita, because you're carrying in the public domain, but the assumption here is what we mean is that you're carrying it, right? We said that carrying, the idea of carrying it is that your issue is that you're really carrying something from outside the tchum, and that you're bringing it in from outside. Right. The issue why it's going to be derabanan, now remember, is because remember we talked about chay noseh atzmo. If something can carry itself, then it's only going to be rabbinic in nature. So therefore, that's why here kivo is only derabanan. So now the idach. What about the other opinion? Why did it's now? It seems pretty obvious. They're only talking about rabbinic law. So how could you possibly say it was talking about with a utensil, which would be forbidden by Torah law? So as we're doing this back and forth, v'idach kivo de lo Rabbi Natan damar chay noseh atzmo havato chay noseh atzmo havato michutz l'tchum ki Rabbi Akiva damar tchumin deoraita. He's now going to say both harkavato and tchumin are going to be deoraita. He's going to assume why, because number one, he doesn't hold like Rabbi Natan, who says chay noseh atzmo is only derabanan. No, he holds chay noseh atzmo. Even if they can carry themselves, it's still forbidden by Torah law. And Yisur Tchumen, if you remember, we saw there was a machloket about it. So he held like Rabbi Akiva, who holds the Tchumen is deoraita. Okay? Okay, so each one reads it as if all the cases are derabanan or all of them are deoraita, and that's going to affect how they read things. Is it kli, or is it not, or is it all biyad? And if it's biyad, then the distinction is yavesh and lach, dry, or right, or like a live wort, which would then be a problem as opposed to a dry one, which is not a problem to cut off. Remember, gozez is taking it off a live sheep. If you took it off a dead sheep, it wouldn't be the same malacha. Mativ Rav Yosef. Now we bring a question of Rav Yosef. Okay, he's going to go against the first opinion. Again, the first opinion was biyad and ha b'kli. Amar Rabbi Eliezer kavachomer umashchita shehi mishum malacha dochet hashabat elu shemishum shvut ein odin sheyitchu et hashabat. So now what do you see here? We just explained, according to the first explanation, that the Mishnah Pesachim was referring to a vessel, to a kli. If it's a kli, then it's forbidden by Torah law. But what does Rabbi Eliezer say when he disagrees with the rabbis? He says it's a kal vachomer. Just like shchita is a malacha that pushes off Shabbat, likewise, elum mishum shvut, all these things that are derabanan, would an ein odin sheyitchu et hashabat. And as he says, shchita is forbidden by the Torah, and yet you're allowed to do it for a sacrifice on Shabbat. So of course, all these derabanans you could do as a sacrifice, which means that Rabbi Eliezer is saying these are all forbidden by rabbinic law, not by Torah law. And our assumption by saying it's a vessel, he's doing it with a vessel, would imply that it's forbidden by Torah law. So therefore, we're going to come up with a different explanation now. Elamar Rav Yosef, ha v'ha biyad, both are biyad, okay, as remember, the first one said yad kli. The second option said they're both biyad. The difference is yavesh and lach. Now he's going to give a different reason. Shvut mikdash b'mikdash itiru, shvut mikdash b'medina lo itiru. When we say, yesterday we discussed that you could have a shvut, that a derabanan in the mikdash, just because you're in the mikdash doesn't mean you can do any derabanan you want. It only means that if you need it for the purposes of working in the mikdash, then you're allowed to. This is kind of taking the reverse. You could also be outside the mikdash. In other words, it's kind of the same idea, which is the location of the mikdash isn't what matters. This one's going to say the location kind of matters. It's going to say that a shvut relating to work in the mikdash is only allowed if you're also in the mikdash. It's not saying the location is the only thing that's important. It's not enough just the location, But if you want to allow a shvut in the mikdash, it's not just something that revolves around something relating to the mikdash. It has to be also done physically in the mikdash. So shvut mikdash b'mikdash hitiru. So if you're doing it in the temple, we're going to allow it. That's our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is talking about taking off the yabelet on an animal while it's in the mikdash. But shvut de mikdash b'medina lo hitiru. But if it's happening in the medina, meaning if you want to cut the abelet off the animal before the animal even gets to the mikdash, even though you want it for the sacrifice, that's not going to be allowed because you have to also be in the location of the temple, not just doing something for the temple service. So therefore, that's the distinction he makes. But now we're going to have a question about this. Yativ Abaye v'ka'amar lahashmata. So Abaye sat down and he said the following. He said exactly this. Eitiv Rav Safra l'Abaye. So Rav Safra now asked Abaye the following question. Look at the Mishnah that we learned previously a few pages ago. Haya koreh b'sefer ali skufa v'nitgalgel sefer miyado golelo etzlo. Now, if you're sitting on the threshold and your book rolls off, now we're making a comparison here, even though you might say it's not the exact comparison between Mikdash and Sifrei Kodesh. Okay, they're not exactly the same thing, but we're going to assume that what's true for the Mikdash is also true for Sifrei Kodesh. Now, it says if you're sitting on the askufa and your book rolls out, you can roll it up. Now, hahacha de shvut de Mikdash b'medinahu. This is a case of an Isser D'Rabbanan, because it's not forbidden, because it's still in your hand, so it's not forbidden by Torah law. It's rolled into the other reshut. And we're going to say, Shvut de Mikdash b'medinahu. V'lo gazrina. Now here, we're going to say, this is a case of Shvut in the Mikdash, meaning Shvut of something sanctified, a D'Rabbanan of something sanctified outside the temple, right? Because you're sitting, you're not in the temple. And what do you notice here? Lo gazrina, dilma ate nafil v'ati leituye. We're not worried that maybe it'll fall out of your hand and you'll end up picking it up and bringing it from the public to the private. And what do we see? It's allowed. Shvut in the mikdash, we're going to allow outside the mikdash. Below kimna, and therefore that's going to reject what we just said. But now the Gemara says, what are you talking about? That's not a comparable case. The reason why that's allowed is for a different reason. Below kimna b'askufa karmelit, b'reshut harabim overet lefaneha. What isn't it the case where the askufa is a karmelit and it's the Reshut Rabim is in front of it? In which case, it's not a case of we're worried you're going to move it from Reshut Rabim to Reshut Yachid. We're worried you're going to move it from Reshut Rabim to a karmelit, which is only forbidden by rabbinic law, and that's why we're not worried. And what did we say? Since you're holding it in your hand, there's not even a shvut there. That's why it's allowed, because it's not even a D'Rabbanan. So you can't even bring this up as a question because this isn't even talking about something forbidden by rabbinic law. Okay, Eitive. Now we're going to have another question against Rav Yosef. Remember, Rav Yosef said they're both biyad, and it's just a matter of, are you doing shvut in the mikdash, or are you doing shvut in the mikdash outside the mikdash? And that's the difference between the two mishnayot. So now we're going to bring another contradiction. Eitive. Mishalshalina ta pesach letanor im chashecha. You can put lower down the pesach into the oven just as it's getting dark, even though it's not going to be fully cooked. Again, we're talking about Erev Pesach that falls on Erev Shabbat. So you're going to end up cooking this on Shabbat. And what's the issue? You're not allowed to cook because you might, if you remember back from a Masechet Shabbat, you might be, even though you put the food in before Shabbat, you might end up being choteh b'chalim. You're going to end up stoking the coals. So, seems they roasted the Korban Pesach outside the temple, not in the temple. And here you see they're not worried about Shema Yachteh. They allow you to put the food up before Shabbat and let it cook on Shabbat. So Ishtik, he was silent and he didn't know what to say, because that's really a good question against what he said, because here's a case of Shvut to Mikdash outside in the Medina, and yet we allow it. And his whole claim was that we don't allow it, and that was why the Mishnah Pesachim didn't allow it. Ki ata l'kamed Rav Yosef Amarle. So when Abaye came before Rav Yosef, he said to him, Amarle, hachi Amarle Rav Safra. This is what Rav Safra said to me. In other words, Abaye said, this is Rav Safra's question. What are you going to say, Rav Yosef? So Amarle, hachi Amarle, my time alot tishanele, b'nei chavura zrizin hen. why don't you just say that the people who are in the Chabura, the Korban Pesach, that's the group, they would get together and do the Korban Pesach in groups. There's reason they're very careful. They're not going to do Shema Yachta because they're busy focusing on the mitzvah of Korban Pesach, and they know the halacha. They're not going to, right? Average person, we have to worry about. People who are involved in the Chabura for Pesach, they're going to be very careful. Now, this is a bit of a strange answer because everybody is part of a Chabura. So it's not like we're talking about unique, special people. You might be saying normally we'd say there's certain categories of people we know we can count on, that they're not going to make those kind of mistakes. Here we're saying it's people in a certain moment of time, or while they're involved in a particular mitzvah, they'll be extra careful. And this you could see, right? When people are, let's say on Yom Kippur, people who aren't careful about things in general, but comes to Yom Kippur, they're super careful. So likewise here, when it comes to doing the Korban Pesach, they're going to be extra careful and they're not going to stoke the coals. That's what the Gemara suggests. That's what Rav Yosef suggests. But Abaye, who didn't come up with that answer on his own, why didn't he? Because Kohanim's reason him amrina. Bnei Chavuras reason him lo amrina. When we say people are extra careful, we normally talk about it. We say the Kohanim. They're very careful about things, but the average person, even if they're in a Chabura, they're not so careful. And that's why he didn't think that was the case. So again, we had so far 3 answers to the contradiction between the 2 Mishnayot. Now we're going to get to a 4th. Rava Amar, Rabbi Eliezer Chita Amar Machshirei Mitzvah Dochin et HaShabbat. So now we're going to say our Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer, who says Machshirei Mitzvah Dochin Shabbat, and the other source is going to be Chachamim, who say Machshirei Mitzvah are not Dochin et HaShabbat, and that's why you can't do it. Okay, so our Mishnah that says you can is Rabbi Eliezer. But what was our question? We already kind of suggested this, but our question was, if that's the case, then it should be allowed even with a utensil, because Machshirei Mitzvah Dochin et HaShabbat, then it should be Doche anything. So now they say, well, Modeh Rabbi Eliezer dekama de'efshar l'shanuyim mishanina. But even Rabbi Eliezer agrees, though, if you have a way to do it with less, right, doing something that's less significant or less problematic, I should say, then better to do it that way. So in this case, you have 2 options, yad or kli. Well, do it b'yad and not b'kli, which is exactly what our Mishnah says, because you're better off changing it in some way. So now they want to know, where do we know that Rabbi Eliezer makes this distinction? Mahi, because Rabbi Eliezer just simply says, Machshirei Mitzvah Dochin et HaShabbat. It sounds like even if it's more severe, more problematic. So where do we get this from? Ditanya. Kohen shal tabo yabelet, chavero chotcho lo b'shinav. If a Kohen gets a yabelet on his body, what do? Because you're not allowed to work when you have this yabelet. So his friend cuts it with his teeth. Okay, sounds a little unpleasant. He basically bites it off of you. So now what can we infer from this? B'shinav in, b'kli lo. Only with his teeth it's allowed, but not with a utensil. So now, and not only that, but chavero in, ihu lo. We're going to have 2 changes here. Number 1, do it with your teeth, not with the utensil. Number 2, have someone else do it instead of you doing it yourself. Imagine you have something on your body like a scab, you'll pick it off yourself. So having someone else take it off is already a shinoi. So now they're going to say, mane, but who does this go according to? And we're going to basically prove that right now we just have a braita. We wanted to show that this is Rabbi Eliezer, who holds when we allow you to do something, we're going to allow you to do it, but find the best way to do it. Don't go overboard and do it in a way that's more severe, right, more problematic. Do it in the better way. But in order to prove it, we have to prove that this is Rabbi Eliezer, and then we'll prove, oh, look, this is Rabbi Eliezer. And what does he say? Don't do it with your hand, with a utensil. Do it with your teeth. Don't do it by yourself. Have a friend do it. So let's see how we prove that this is Rabbi Eliezer. Mani. If you say this is the rabbis who say Machshirei Mitzvah are not overriding Shabbat, and then you would have to say Ubimikdash. Well, the reason we allow it here must be because it's something special, and it's because of the Mikdash, right? And that's because the Kohen needs to get rid of it for the work purposes. Well, then, Keva da'amre Rabbanan, the Alma, since the rabbis said that you can do this in any case, Mishum Shvut, Hacha malihu mali chavero. In other words, if we're going to allow this to cut it off with your teeth in the temple, Well, then because of Shvut, because again, once in order, if Rabbi Eliezer holds Machshirei Mitzvah Dochinit HaShabbat, even in Doraita law, fine. But if we say it's not Doche Shabbat, and then we're only allowing it because you're in the temple. Now remember, what's overridden in the temple? Any Isurei Derabanan. So it must be Derabanan. What makes this a Derabanan? Because you did it with your teeth. But then you don't need Chavero. You could do it yourself. In other words, what does Chavero add to it? If it's Rabbanan, then doing it with your teeth should be sufficient. You don't need also Chavero. So now what do they answer? So therefore, Hachi Mali Hu Mali Chavero, it should make a difference. And therefore, Elalav, Rabbi Eliezer. It must be Rabbi Eliezer. Now, how does Rabbi Eliezer work in with this? Amar Ba'alma Chayav Chatat. Generally, if you were to do this, even with your teeth, we're going to assume he thinks you're Chayav Chatat. Now, this actually, I forgot to mention, this goes to a basic machloket. It's a very interesting machloket. If you pull out your hair or take off your nails, cut off your nails, if you do it with a utensil, the rabbis say that's d'oraita. If you do it with your hands or with your teeth, that's already not a typical way of doing it, and then that's going to drop it down to a d'rabbanan. But what does Rabbi Eliezer say? Rabbi Eliezer says no. When it comes to hair or teeth, all of those are typical ways of doing it. Think about how many people bite their nails and how many people, pull out their hair with their hands. So that is a typical way of doing it, and therefore, or let's even put it a different way. It's going to be just as effective. You'll get the exact same results if you cut your nail off with your teeth or if you break your nail off with a nail clipper. Okay, maybe it'll be a little cleaner if you do it with a nail clipper, but in the end, you've basically cut it off. It's all the same thing with your hair. So therefore, Rabbi Eliezer says that when it comes to an action like that, it's all going to be forbidden by Torah law. If that's the case and it's by Torah law, well, then why is it allowed here? So therefore, what's his whole reasoning? Oh, we don't care that it's d'oraita because it's not because we're doing it in the mikdash like the rabbis. No, it's because it's machshirei mitzvah. Machshirei mitzvah, even on a d'oraita you can do. However, if you have a choice, better to do it, and this is what we're going to see, right? Why does he say that you do it b'shinav and someone else do it for you? Because even though doing it b'shinav is d'oraita, better to have someone else do it for you. And again, you're doing something different than normal. And therefore, you're already going to drop it down a level. And what do you see from here? That even though Rabbi Eliezer allows machshirei mitzvah to push off Shabbat, he still prefers you to do it in the minimalist way, in the least possible problematic way. Okay, and that's why. So that's their proof that that's what Rabbi Eliezer holds. And that was all to come show us how we know that, right? That was to prove Rava's reading, the fourth reading we had of the contradiction between the Mishnah and the Braita, that it's Rabbi Eliezer who says machshirei mitzvah or dochin et hashabat, but better to do it in a minimal way, and that's why bikli is a problem and biyad is okay. So now the Gemara says no, lo la'olam rabbanan. No, you could say this is all rabbanan. Why specifically then your friend and not you yourself? He explains it for technical reasons. He says like this: so hachinami. If you did it, if it came up in your abdomen, the yabelet, the wart, then obviously, then it would be the same, meaning it would be doing it with your teeth would be sufficient. But because remember, according to the rabbis, doing it with your teeth is already a d'rabbanan, and that's enough because it's in the mikdash. But kigon sha'altalo nishicha begabo ubatzilei yadav di'iu lo matzi shakile. The reason here is because it's in a location where you can't access it. Okay, they say it could be you got bitten by something and from there developed a wart on your back or on your elbow. Now, at both those places, imagine you try to take it off by yourself. I can't get to my elbow, right? It's impossible for me to reach my elbow or my back. And therefore, it's just technical why you have the friend do it, okay? It's describing a situation where you need someone else to do it for technical reasons, but it has nothing to do with halachic reasons, okay? And therefore, it says that can't be the issue. Now they say, but wait, this doesn't work either. V'i rabbanan nishkele niale biyad. If you're going to say it's by the rabbi, it's according to the rabbi's opinion, then he should be able to also do it by hand. In other words, we talked about now teeth versus kli, utensil. But until now, we've been discussing, before we brought up this teeth case, we've been discussing by hand or by kli. And we already said that the rabbis say that when it comes to taking off nails and all that, it would be either by hand or by teeth. So by hand is a little more normal than by teeth. And therefore, if by hand is going to be allowed by the rabbis, because it's only rabbinic, and therefore shvut is permitted in the mikdash, then it should have said biyad and not with your teeth. And furthermore, v'tifsho to Rabbi Elazar, and then we'd be able to have an answer for Rabbi Elazar, or say, will we be able to prove Rabbi Elazar? Tamar Rabbi Elazar, machloket biyad, aval b'kli divrei hakol chayav. Everyone agrees that you can't do it with a utensil. It's just a debate between, again, Rabbi Elazar and the rabbis who debate whether it's forbidden to do it with your teeth. Also say with your hand. Okay, their machloket is about whether you do it with your hand. But everyone agrees that if you take it with a utensil, take out your hair or cut your nails, it will be forbidden. So if he'd used the example of biyad, we'd have been able to say, we'd be able to prove Rabbi Elazar. So therefore, they don't want to say that it's really Rabbanan and biyad, which then goes back to saying this is Rabbi Eliezer, and this proves that Rabbi Eliezer holds that even though you're allowed to prepare machshirei mitzvah on Shabbat, still better off doing it in the most minimal way possible. But now the Gemara says, wait a minute, v'litamech Rabbi Eliezer nami lishkale niale biyad. So still, according to Rabbi Eliezer, even according to Rabbi Eliezer, you should be able to do it biyad. So why does it say teeth if you could do it also by hand? So, hi mai. So now they say, no, that's not a question, because Rabbi Eliezer, hainu degazer yad atu kli. If you say it's Rabbi Eliezer, you can very well explain that, well, again, better off not to do it biyad, because biyad will make you think that you could do it with a utensil. So therefore, do it with your teeth. But if it, because again, go minimal as you can. But if it was the rabbis, you would just say biyad, and that would be sufficient. You wouldn't need any less than that. That would be fine. That would already drop it to Rabbanan, and you're doing it for the mikdash, and it would be fine. So again, we're back to saying this could really be Rabbi Eliezer, and this would prove to us that even though machshirei mitzvah are dochin et Shabbat, do it in the most minimal way possible. Okay, new Mishnah. Kohen shalaka be'etzba'o. If you have an injury on your finger and you don't want to walk around in the mikdash with a big noticeable injury, okay, this is problematic because people don't want you to walk around thinking that, everything, we like this idea, and we'll get to this when we get to Yoma and other sugyot, about perfection in the temple. You want things to look very nice. So here you have a wound, an injury, you don't want everybody to see it. So what do? Now, normally you're not allowed to put a gemi on. A gemi is a reed to wrap it with a kind of bandage, because it's also medicinal in nature. And remember that you can't do medicine on Shabbat, and that's it's forbidden by rabbinic law, because you might come to grind the medicine. So therefore, you can do it b'mikdash, avalo b'medina, but you can't do it outside the mikdash again, because it's medicine, and that's forbidden by rabbinic law. Im lahotzi dam kam b'kanasur. But if you're putting it on where you're wounded in order to get the blood to come out, well, that's going to be forbidden no matter what, because that's forbidden by Torah law to cause blood to come out of your body. That's chabala, it's considered. So Amarav Yehuda Berei Rabbi Chia, we're going to have two versions of this. In fact, I'm going to go a little bit farther till the next Mishnah. Lo shanu elageni, aval tzultzul katan havi yitor b'gadim. He says, wait, this Mishnah is only referring to, okay, this is Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Chia, says, this is only talking about putting on a reed wrapping a reed around you. But if you put it tzultzul katan, like a sash, okay, a kind of belt thing, then that's like adding extra clothing, and you're not allowed to add. The Kohen has a certain amount of clothing, right? There's the clothing that the Kohen wears. Can't wear anything extra than that. So putting a sash on would be like adding clothing. But we're going to see now a dissenting opinion. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Lo Amru Yitor B'Gadim Ela B'Mkom B'Gadim. It's only a problem, and this is kind of like Bal Tosif and Bal Tigara. We have this whole thing of when something's considered that you're adding. You're only considered adding clothing if you're adding it in a place where normally there's clothing. Here he's putting it around his finger. That's not a place where you wear clothing. It's not considered extra clothes if it's not a place where you normally wear clothing. So then they say, but wait, but shouldn't it be a problem because you have a barrier between, we talked about this just before, you can't have a barrier between the Kohen's hand and the work that when he's working. So he can't have a sash on his hand. It should be a problem. Or the gemi, really. The sash we said is a problem in any case. But, well, again, it depends who you hold by, right? We're saying according to Rabbi Yochanan, a sash is not a problem. But now they're saying shouldn't be a problem. Both it's tziltzul and a gemi because you're creating a chatzitza. So they say bismol, it's on his left hand, a place where he doesn't do the avoda. Then it's only a chatzitza separation if he's doing the work with that hand, but his left hand he doesn't use to do work. We're going to see this all when we get to korbanot stuff, that everything is done with the right hand, unless there's no choice and certain things have to be done with two hands. There's exceptions to the rule. We'll see this in Yoma. Inami biyamin shelo b'mkom avodah, or on his right hand, but with a part of his hand that he doesn't actually use for the avodah. Like let's say you put it on the back of your hand. Okay, that would work. Upliga de Rava. So we started with Rav Yehuda Bered Rav Chia, who said only gemi, but not a sash. Sash would be a problem because of Yitor Begadim. Came Rabbi Yochanan, he said that's not Yitor Begadim because you don't wear it in a place where you put clothing. And now they're going to say Upliga de Rava. But Rava disagrees with Rabbi Yochanan. How so? Ta'amar Rava amar Rav Chisda, b'mkom begadim afilu nima achat chotzetzet. Shelo b'mkom begadim shalosh al shalosh chotzetzot. Pachot shalosh al shalosh enan chotzetzot. So now he says like this. If it's in the place of begadim, then even adding one extra string is going to be a problem. But shelo b'mkom begadim, if it's not in a place of your clothes, remember Rabbi Yochanan said if it's not in the place of your clothes, it's no problem at all. But now we're going to say it's not in the place of your clothes. It all depends on the size. If it's less than 3 by 3 fingers width, then it's not a problem. But if it's more than that, then it's already significant. And even if it's not in the place where you normally wear clothes, it's going to be a problem. So now we're going to say that Rava clearly, ad Rabbi Yochanan vadai pliga, clearly disagrees with Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said it's not Yitor Begadim if it's in a place where you don't normally put clothing on. But ad Rav Yehuda Bered Rabbi Chia minema pligi. But it's not clear if he's disagreeing with Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Chia, because he said only gemi, not a sash. A sash would be Yitor Begadim. Now, a sash, it's not clear. Is Rava disagreeing with Rabbi Chia about the sash? So now they're going to say, in other words, is he disagreeing with him about the sash? Because a sash is probably not 3 by 3. So therefore, maybe he is disagreeing with him. So now the Gemara says, no. Shani tziltzul katan dechashiv. Even though it's not 3 by 3, it has significance. What's the idea of 3 by 3? The idea of 3 by 3 is if it's anything less than that, it's just not significant. But a sash is significant because it's not meant to be a beged, a cloak would have to be 3 by 3. Otherwise, it's really not significant, like a piece of cloth. But if you have a sash, even though it's less than 3 by 3, it's important because it's a sash. So therefore, it would have importance, in which case he would think that it would be Yitor Begadim, just like Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rabbi Chia. Okay? Now, let's read the whole sugya with a different version. Lishna Achrina, Amrula, they said a different variation of this sugya. Okay, so far it's pretty much the same, although some people say, no, it's actually, in the first version, he said, tziltzul katan is yitor begadim, and here it's talking about chatzitza. Some people say it's the same, some people say, no, these are two different issues. Okay, one is adding clothing to the big day kahuna, adding extra clothing, and the other is this considered a barrier between his hand and whatever he's doing, worshiping the avoda, and doing the service. But again, it's the main thing is it's saying gemi yes, tziltzul katan no, right? Or tziltzul katan is problematic. So Rabbi Yochanan Amar lo amru chatzitza b'pachot mishalosh al shalosh ela b'mkom begadim. Now we have a different version of Rabbi Yochanan. He says here when they said chatzitza, right? B'pachot mishalosh al shalosh, there's no chatzitza, okay? Ela b'mkom begadim, okay? And it's when it's less than 3 by 3, it's going to be a chatzitza if it's in the place where normally you have clothes. אבל שלא במקום בגדים, 3 על 3 חוצצות, פחות מ3 אין חוצצות. But if it's in a place where you don't normally have begadim, then only if it's 3 by 3 will it create a separation, a barrier. V'hainu de Rava, and that matches Rava. That's exactly what Rava said. Okay, so in this version, Rava and Rabbi Yochanan are the same. Amar Rav Chisda, lema pliga de Rav Yehuda berei de Rav Yichia. So now they're going to suggest, doesn't it sound like they're arguing with him? Because he said it's tzultzul katan is a problem, is chatzitza, and they say you're wearing it in a place where there's no clothing, it would have to be 3 by 3. So again, the Gemara is going to say, no, shane tzultzul katan de chashiv. In other words, you could say tzultzul katan is going to be a problem, even according to Rabbi Yochanan, even though it's not b'mkom b'gadim, because it has significance. Okay. And now the Rabbi Yochanan adashmi'inan gemi lishmi'inan tzultzul katan. So now, according to Rabbi Yochanan, why did our Mishnah only mention gemi and not a tzultzul katan? It should have said tzultzul katan, right? That even that you can put on your hand if that's what he thought. So they say milta agav orche kamashban. It was because the Mishnah wanted to teach you something different, because a sash is not something that's medicinal in nature. Here, in other words, they're talking about the issue of is it a chatzitz, is it a problem that he has it on him? But the Mishnah was referring really to the issue of refu'ah, of doing something that's medicinal in nature. The gemi masi, it's to teach you that even though gemi, putting a reed, will help heal it, it's still going to be allowed because, again, shvut b'mikdash is allowed. And that's why they chose to talk about gemi and not a tzultzul katan, even though tzultzul katan is more significant than gemi. And tzultzul katan will also be allowed. But it's to teach you that gemi is merapeh. And despite that, you're still allowed to put it on your finger on Shabbat. Okay, with that, we'll finish. And tomorrow's daf, we will finish up. I will hopefully post before Shabbat, and we will get very close to the end of the Masechet.